Welcome to the podcast. If you'd like to listen to an ad-free version of this episode and all of our episodes, then search True Crime Today Premium Plus on Apple Podcasts and press subscribe. That's our premium channel where all of our ad-free and advanced episodes live, all in one place. True Crime Today Premium Plus. Search it on Apple Podcasts and press subscribe. Even try it for 3 days free.
You're about to take a deep dive into one of the biggest true crime cases in the universe. Or, at least, on our part of the planet. From the Hidden Killers podcast and True Crime Today.
All right, ready for a deep dive. Today, it's straight into the Menendez brothers case.
A case that just won't quit on, decades later. And people are still totally hung up on guilt, innocence, you name it.
And this new Netflix documentary, The Menendez Brothers, I tore through every article, every interview I could find.
They kept everyone talking.
But honestly, what really hooked me wasn't just the case itself, it was the director's whole approach.
Alejandro Hartmann, right? Talk about a unique take on a story that's been told a million times.
Seriously, the article I read, it called him a blank slate. He's from Argentina, barely even knew about the case back in the 90s when it was everywhere.
Can you imagine? Most people coming into this, they've got baggage, years of media coverage, opinions already formed.
Exactly. So starting fresh, it's got to be an advantage, right?
Huge. Think about it, no preconceived notions. He goes straight to the source. Lyle and Erik Menendez, talking to them with a totally clean slate. He even got Lyle on camera. First time in decades.
Whoa, hold on. That alone is insane. How do you convince Lyle to open up after all this time?
It's kind of unexpected, but the key was, get this, soccer. Turns out Lyle's a huge fan, and they just, bonded over it before any of the heavy stuff.
Wow, talk about disarming the situation. And it gets even more interesting. The article mentioned how Hartmann, he refuses to call their conversations interviews.
He calls them chats, right?
Yeah, chats. Like, what a difference does that make?
Totally. Interview, it's formal, kind of confrontational, but chats, it's like relaxed, open. And when you're dealing with a case this sensitive, that vibe is everything.
Oh, absolutely. Especially with what they're discussing, patricide, alleged abuse. Like, how do you even begin to unpack that?
Exactly. And that's where Hartmann's approach is so brilliant. He's not just trying to get the brother's side. He's trying to understand the whole picture.
Right, like all sides of it.
And to do that, you got to have multiple perspectives, right? He talks to Pam Bozanich, the prosecutor.
Wow.
He talks to journalists who cover the case, even some jurors. It's like each conversation adds another piece to the puzzle. And suddenly, it's not so black and white anymore.
Right. It becomes less about who's right or wrong and more about trying to understand the why, which, let's be honest, that's what keeps us coming back to true crime, isn't it?
Totally. And one of the things that struck me is how differently we might view this case today. The hashtag #MeToo movement, it's shifted our understanding of abuse, power, consent.
Things that maybe weren't given the same weight back then.
Exactly. And Hartmann, he doesn't shy away from that. He even talks about how Core TV putting the entire trial on YouTube has changed the game.
Oh, wow. Yeah. A whole new generation watching this.
Right. Uncut, raw footage.
Yeah.
Makes you think, if social media had been around in the 90s.
Who knows how different things might be? Okay, so we've got this fresh perspective, the brothers opening up, the hashtag #MeToo era, adding these new layers. Where do we even go from here?
Well, we've talked about the who and the how, but to really get into it, we need to dig into the what. What did Hartmann actually find by revisiting this case with fresh eyes? And what does it tell us about how true crime has changed?
Okay, so we've got fresh eyes on the case, unprecedented access, and this whole backdrop of like how we understand things differently now. But the real meat of this deep dive, it's the what did Hartmann actually uncover? I mean, where do we even begin?
It's tough, right?
Yeah.
There's so much. But that conversation with Pam Bozanich, the prosecutor, man, that one really stayed with me.
Yeah. To even get her on camera years after arguing so passionately for their guilt.
Right. Talk about intense.
I can't even imagine revisiting that, all the emotion of that case. Did she ever waver at all looking back?
It's interesting. You might expect her to double down.
Right.
Stand firm on everything from the trials.
Yeah, totally.
But there's this moment, I'm paraphrasing here, but she talks about the toll it took.
Mm-hmm.
The trial, the public scrutiny. And not just on her, on everyone.
Wow, okay, so a little vulnerability there. But on the fundamental question, did justice get served?
She doesn't explicitly say.
Yeah.
But it's more about what she doesn't say, No big declarations of guilt. The focus is more on, the human cost of it all. And then she brings up how, even now, people still debate this case so passionately. And I think that says something, you know?
Oh, for sure. Even the prosecutor, who you'd think would have a pretty clear-cut view, acknowledges how messy it all is. Did Hartmann talk to the jurors? Like, I'm so curious what they make of it all now.
He did. And it's wild listening to those interviews. It's like a time warp. Back then, that whole defense argument about abuse, a lot of people just weren't buying it. The brothers were seen as spoiled rich kids, right?
Really? It played right into that whole media narrative, Beverly Hills murder. It was made for TV.
Right. And Hartmann talks about that too. He's got Alan Abramson, who was covering it blow by blow for the LA Times back in the day.
He was everywhere during that trial.
Right. And Abramson, he's still convinced they're guilty. But then you have someone like Robert Rand, who literally wrote the book arguing that the brothers were abused, that everything they did stemmed from that trauma. It's crazy how two people can look at the same case and see something totally different.
And isn't that like the heart of what makes this whole thing so fascinating?
Exactly. It's not about picking sides. It's about understanding that truth can be subjective, especially in a case like this. Hartmann actually does this really cool thing where he'll show footage from court TV and then he cuts to like YouTube reaction videos of people watching it today.
Oh, wow. So same evidence, same testimony, but completely different reactions.
Exactly. It really shows how much perspective matters.
Yeah.
And then there's the brothers themselves.
Right. What'd you make of them, hearing them talk to Hartmann after all these years?
It's raw, you know?
Yeah.
There's this vulnerability there that's really striking. They talk about the murders, obviously, but also about their childhood, their parents. And they're not shying away from the horror of what they did, but there's this undercurrent of grief, too.
So it's less about the what of the crime and more about the why of their lives, right?
Exactly. And he's not trying to say they're innocent, not at all. But he's trying to understand what led them to that point. And that's where the #MeToo lens is so important.
Because those abuse allegations, what might have been dismissed back then, suddenly hits a lot harder now.
It's true.
Yeah.
We're just more aware now, right, of how insidious abuse is, how it can twist your reality, how it can manifest in these really extreme ways. And Hartmann never says, believe the brothers, but he presents their story, their trauma, in a way that makes you at least consider its impact.
It's so easy to get sucked into the true crime thing, right? The shock value. But what you just said, that's what gets lost sometimes, the human element.
Totally. These aren't like characters in a story. These are real people who went through something horrific, unimaginable, really.
And you got to wonder, back then, all that media attention, the way they portrayed the brothers, did that shape how we understood everything? Not just the trial, but the bigger issues too?
It's hard to say for sure, but what Hartmann does so well is like he puts those two things side by side. The media circus from the 90s and how people are talking about the case now. He'll show those old court TV clips.
And then,
bam, cut to YouTube comments, reaction videos, people dissecting the exact same stuff, but through a totally different lens.
it's crazy how many young people, I mean, people who weren't even alive during the trial, are forming these strong opinions.
Right. It's like this whole new jury of public opinion has emerged.
Yeah.
And it just shows you the way we think about this stuff, it's always changing. Things that were easy to brush aside back then, like coercive control, the impact of childhood trauma. Now, people are really starting to pay attention.
And with that comes this need to re-examine our own biases, you know? What did we bring to this story? It's like Hartmann's asking us, okay, put yourself back then. How would you have judged this? And how does what we know now change things?
Exactly. It's like constantly reminding ourselves that seeking understanding, being open to different perspectives, it's an ongoing thing. And it's not always easy or comfortable.
Especially with true crime, right? You're dealing with the darkest parts of humanity. There's no easy answers.
And that's what makes Hartmann's approach so refreshing. He's not telling us what to think. He's more like, here's everything, the good, the bad, all the messy stuff. Now let's talk about it.
Yeah, and that's what's made this deep dive so interesting. It's not just about them, the Menendez brothers. It's about us, too, how we engage with these stories.
Right. We're not just passively watching. We're part of how the narrative gets shaped.
And that's a powerful takeaway for everyone, right? True crime fan or not. Approaching difficult stuff with empathy, with nuance. It's so important.
Absolutely. Never stop questioning, never stop learning.
Couldn't agree more. Well, this has been quite a journey. Unpacking this case with you all, the history, the media frenzy, those personal stories.
Always a pleasure to dive into these stories with you. It's amazing how they reflect the times we're in, even decades later.
And to everyone listening, we highly recommend checking out the documentary for yourself, form your own opinions. Until next time, keep asking those tough questions, keep those critical thinking caps on, and thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
In a world where the darkest secrets lie just beneath the surface,
They said it was an accident, but the evidence says otherwise.
where hidden killers roam unnoticed in the shadows.
I think you would definitely be looking at a blend of toxic, very bad narcissistic personality traits, and they will be vengeful and possibly resort to violence.
Join Tony Bruschi as he uncovers the truth behind the most chilling cases.
They said it was an accident, but the evidence clearly says otherwise.
Each episode, we dig deep into the minds of those who commit the unthinkable.
To your point on narcissism, he thinks in his own mind how witty he is.
Yeah.
But he lost that jury. I was done with him in 2 minutes.
From unsolved mysteries to infamous crimes.
Geez, you've just talked about how you've taught yourself how to do everything under the sun. I bet you did a YouTube video, how to best kill somebody with a knife.
Hidden Killers with Tony Bruschi takes you where few dare to go.
How does someone with such a dark secret go unnoticed for so long?
With multiple new episodes every single day.
We're not just telling stories, we're seeking justice.
Listen now on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. Just search for Hidden Killers with Tony Bruschi.